Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you happen to be. This is John West again with Japanese Business and Economy. Yes, this is John West again, back for our second class of Japanese Business and Economy. And in this class, we're going to be looking at Japan's post-war resurgence, Japan's post-war comeback, the rapid economic development that Japan enjoyed following World War II. In this lecture, right now, we're going to be looking at the role of labour and workers, along with investment. Now, you recall that Japan was totally destroyed by the end of World War II. This photo here shows Tokyo. The carpet bombing of Tokyo destroyed much of the city. But as you've seen in this chart, which I showed before, from 1945 through to 1970, Japan enjoyed a fantastic comeback, a fantastic period of very rapid growth. In that period from 1950 to 1973, Japan averaged over 8% economic growth each year. That's a little bit like China has enjoyed of recent decades. Japan then slowed down a little bit in the period from 1973 to 1990, and it only grew by about 3%. So a bit of a slowdown compared with the previous period, but still a period of solid growth. In this second period from 73 to 1990, Japan had to navigate the oil price shocks as OPEC lifted oil prices substantially on two occasions during that period. Many people are surprised at how countries like Japan and like China can grow very quickly. Economists call this the benefit of backwardness. When an economy is at the bottom of the ladder, it's very easy, with the right policies, I insist, to grow very quickly as you climb from the very bottom up. The more you climb the development ladder, the harder it becomes to enjoy fast growth. There's lots of easy benefits that can be enjoyed just by investing, educating your population, and opening your markets. Now, by 1990, as you can see in this chart, Japan's GDP per capita had reached 80% of the US level. I point to the chart very clearly. The red line there is the line of Japan, with it going up very sharply after 1945. The blue line is that of the United States. So about 1990, Japan had caught up by about 80%. It was about 80% of the level of the US in terms of GDP per capita. Then after 1990, the two lines move in different directions. The gap opens up again. This is something that we'll be exploring during our course. Now, not only did Japan grow very rapidly in terms of GDP per capita, it also transformed itself from a low-tech to a high-tech economy. You'll see in this photo here a Japanese toilet. In Japan, even the toilets are high-tech. So if you come here, be careful. Japan also transformed itself from an agricultural economy to more of a manufacturing economy, and of recent times, a more service-based economy. This is a natural transition as economies become more sophisticated, from agriculture to manufacturing to services. On top of that, Japan transformed itself from a rural to an urban society. Today, most Japanese, 85% or so, live in urban settings, towns and cities. But as I mentioned before, Japan never actually fully caught up to the United States. And since the 1990s, it has been slipping backwards. But this story of Japan slipping backwards, that's something for our future classes. For this class today, we're looking at Japan's rise from the destruction of World War II. So as we're thinking about, as we're analysing Japan's very rapid growth, Japan's very rapid comeback from World War II, the fundamental question is, how do economies grow? How do economies grow? And there are a few elements which are key to understanding how economies grow. Firstly, there is labour or workers. Secondly, there is investment. Thirdly, there's productivity, which boils down to the efficiency with which we use our labour and investment. Then there are political factors which also can play a role. Now, governments can play an important role in fostering an economic growth by investing in education and infrastructure. So government has a role to play there. And also governments can create a business-friendly environment which enable business to invest and create jobs and produce products. Lastly, I'd like to mention is that an open and growing world economy can help too by providing markets for our exports. Now, in this lecture, we're going to concentrate on the importance of labour or workers. When we're thinking of labour or workers, we should think of the quality of the workers and the quantity of the workers. What do I mean by quality of workers? I basically mean education and training. And it's pretty obvious that the more educated workers are, the better training the workers are, the more efficient and productive they will be. Now, in the case of Japan, Japan has always had a pretty good education system. In fact, if you go back to the period from 1600 to 1868, this is called the Edo period, the 250 years of peace, education actually became quite widespread in Japan, not only amongst the elite, but even amongst the common people. And during this period of time, the level of literacy in Japan, in fact, was much better than it was in Europe. Moving forward to today's world, there are different exercises which measure the quality of education around the world. Now, the OECD, an organization based in Paris, has one program called the Program for International Student Assessment. And this PISA study, it focuses on reading, mathematics and science of 15-year-old students all around the world. Now, this is very interesting, this study, because it provides us with information on the abilities, the capabilities of 15-year-old students. It doesn't tell us everything that we may wish to know about education, but it provides very interesting information. Now, in the last PISA study in the year 2018, there were about 79 countries that participated in the exercise. Now, when it comes to reading, only 10 of these 79 countries outperformed Japan. Only 10 out of 79 did better in Japan for reading. When it comes to maths, Japan was even stronger. There was only 4 countries that did better than Japan. And in science, 3 countries did better than Japan. So overall, I think we can say that Japan's education system seems to be pretty good when we look at the results of the PISA study. When it comes to science, maths and reading, Japan does very well. Now, notwithstanding these excellent results in the PISA study, some experts question the quality of Japanese education. And when they question the quality of Japanese education, one of the points that many experts emphasize is that Japan employs rote learning, memorization, and training for tests. What we mean by rote learning is that Japanese students, in many instances, learn things by heart. They memorize things, and their schools spend a lot of time training students to pass tests more than training students to learn. This is a standard criticism that is well known in Japan, and it's a criticism also made of China, Korea, and other countries. And the Japanese authorities are well aware of this criticism, and I think acknowledge it to a substantial extent, and are trying to work to improve the situation. But still, the situation exists of rote learning, memorization, and training for tests. In the same vein, many experts argue that there is not enough focus on critical thinking, analytical ability, creativity, and communication skills. I repeat those points: critical thinking, analytical ability, creativity, and communication skills. Experts argue that there is not enough focus on these factors in the Japanese education system. Now, I've been teaching at Sophia University for over 10 years. And I've met many, many excellent Japanese students. But I must say that one thing that I always notice is that Japanese students rarely ask questions or enter into class discussions. And that students from other countries, Western countries in particular, are much more active in asking questions or entering into class discussions. Now, this criticism about rote learning, about memorization and preparing for tests, this is reinforced by the role of what some people call cram schools. In Japanese, it's known as juku. Now, have a look at this photo. Now, this is young Japanese students at night school. After their school is closed, they leave the school, go home, then they go off to night school to study more, to learn how to prepare for their tests. Now, when I was that age, when school finished, I used to go off with my friends playing football and cricket and having fun. But in Japan and some other East Asian countries, young kids go off to night school. And this tends to reinforce this approach of memorization and rote learning and preparing for tests. Now, there's another concern about Japan's education system, and this is the nation's poor level of English language skills. Now, most Japanese students actually spend quite a bit of time learning English, but they tend to learn English grammar, reading of the English language. And often the English language education is conducted in Japanese, explained in Japanese. And what this means is that the Japanese students are much weaker when it comes to expressing themselves in English. Now, according to the EF English Proficiency Index, Japan has a quite low level of proficiency in the English language and ranks only 55th in the world. Now, I'll click on this. Now, I'll put this link on my website so you can consult it by yourself. Now, it's very interesting. This shows a global ranking of countries and regions in terms of their English language ability. And it's in 5 groups, going from very high to moderate to low, and then very low. Now, you'll see in here, as you look through, Japan is in the 4th category, which means a low level of proficiency in English at 55. Now, there are many other Asian and other countries which are ahead of Japan. Singapore, 10th. Philippines, 27th. Malaysia, 30th. Now, you may say that these countries are former British or American colonies, and that therefore they have an advantage in learning the English language. This is true. But Korea, which was not colonized at all by Britain or by America, in fact, it was colonized by Japan. Korea is 32nd, much stronger than Japan, for example. And China, at 38th, again, is stronger than Japan. Now, I feel embarrassed as an English speaker pushing this point about English language skills. But the reality in the world today is that the English language is the language of international business. It's also the language of international science and technology, and also economic and geopolitical analysis. All global discussions, all international discussions take place in English. This is just the reality. And by being a bit weak in the English language, Japan is actually cutting itself off to some extent from the rest of the world. I've seen this actually when I've worked in international organizations, the OECD I worked for, the Asian Development Bank I worked for, and it's sometimes very difficult for Japanese experts to get jobs and even to function in these organizations because of their poor English language skills, because all the work at the OECD and at the Asian Development Bank is conducted in the English language. Now, this is a pity for Japan and the Japanese people. The Japanese people are cut off from many international experiences because of this, and the Japanese country, the economy, the society is also cut off from the rest of the world to some extent. Now, I read some time ago a very interesting quote from a Nobel Prize-winning Japanese scientist, Professor Susumu Tonegawa. Now, he had some very interesting comments on Japan's education. And he said, having spent half a century abroad since I went to the United States to study, I now regard Japan as a society rather dictated by rules. Within a fixed framework, the Japanese are able to produce things with extreme precision. Now, I can understand this comment because Japan's excellence in manufacturing is to some extent based on the capacity of Japanese people to work with extreme precision. But making a comparison with the United States, Tonegawa said, a climate that respects individualistic thinking not bounded by conventional wisdom, will produce revolutionary discoveries that shatter the framework. Unlike the Japanese, Americans put their own ideas first, and what others think of them is secondary. He concludes it is essential to have an education that respects individual abilities and preferences. So Japan can make excellence inside a framework, but for new ideas, for major breakthroughs, for revolutionary thinking, an education system and a society like America is much more productive. Now, I'd like to finish this section of our class with an interview with Mr. Hiroshi Mikitani, who is CEO of Rakuten. You remember we've spoken about Rakuten before, and Rakuten is in many ways Japan's answer to Amazon in e-commerce. And he is a very interesting gentleman, Mr. Hiroshi Mikitani, and you'll hear him speaking about the importance of the English language in his business.
Part of your global strategy in 2012, you told the company, I know we're a Japanese company, I know that there's 11,000 of you here, but English is going to be our first language. Well, how did you do that?
I stood in front of 3,000 employees, and suddenly announced, okay, from today, we are going to use English as our standard communication language. And everybody didn't really understand what does it mean. The official meetings are done in English. Our email is going to be in English, and since then, 5 years has passed. 80% of new engineers we are hiring right now in Tokyo are non-Japanese. So we see many Indians, Americans, Europeans, Chinese, and I think we have done a great job. You know, it's not 100% perfect, and diversity it is the most important strategy for Rakuten.
So one other interesting thing that you guys do is you used to have golf corporate outings, but now your executives climb this mountain that is supposedly claimed more depths than Mount Everest.
To have a team building, because we are so diversified company. Our executives are not only Japanese, but many, of course, Americans, Europeans, Chinese, and so forth. So I wanted to create some kind of project to really enhance our team spirit. So I found this mountain. I did mountain climbing with my son once, and found, oh, this is kind of tough. Maybe not so tough, but it's just tough enough. Our executive need to help each other to really climb up as a group. So that was the motivation, and we have been doing this for 7 years.
One thing it seems like, I think I was reading that the number of developers that are there, it's the sheer numbers game. So I think 20,000 engineers graduate from Japanese colleges every year versus 160,000 in the States,
yes,
and 1 million in China.
Right.
So is that part of your strategy? Are you trying to, I know you said you're hiring, I think 80%
Right.
of engineers around the world.
Yeah, we cannot really just do business with Japanese engineers anymore. 90% of our data scientists are non-Japanese in Japan, right? And they have a really diversified background. Some people work for retail business over here. Most of them are PhDs from very top-class universities. And you cannot find those kind of talent, unfortunately, in Japan. So I think Tokyo is one of the most comfortable city to live. It's metropolitan, it's diversified, it's secure. So I think it's not so difficult for us to hire global talent and convince them to move to Tokyo.
So there you heard the very interesting story from Mr. Hiroshi Mikitani about his program of Englishization, he calls it, and diversity in Rakuten. And we heard in particular how Rakuten has adopted English as the corporate language. And when you have a company that has staff from all different countries of the world, like India, Europe, America, China, and Japan, it's important that all the staff communicate with one language. That's particularly in the case of emails, so that everyone on copy of the email can understand. It's important in staff meetings so that everyone can understand. And as Mikitani said, his company, Rakuten, a Japanese company now, is hiring most of its data scientists from other countries. So again, using one language, the English language as the corporate language, is essential. So this brings us to the end of our study of education and the quality of Japanese labor. And I think we can say certainly that when it comes to the level of education and training, Japanese workers, Japanese labor, have a very high level of education. And in that way, they are very productive. And it's not surprising that Japan should be a rich and prosperous country. But we had a couple of criticisms to make. One is that the question of Japanese education emphasizing rote learning, memorization, and preparing for exams. And secondly, the other criticism we had to make was on the level of English in Japan. Now I'd like to move on to the question of the quantity of Japanese labor available for the economy. Now, today, Japan has an aging population. More and more old people are in the population. The working age population has been declining since the 1990s. Japan is often said to be the world's oldest country. But from 1950 through to the 1990s, Japan's high growth period, Japan's working age population was actually increasing sharply thanks to the post-war baby boom. And so the quantity of Japanese labor was increasing through this period. You've probably heard, it's well known that when peace came back to the world after 1945, people started making families again, family sizes started growing, and there was a post-war baby boom. Now, if you look at this chart, it's very interesting again. If you look at the chart and you see the blue section, the working age population, you see there that this blue section gets bigger and bigger from 1950 through to 1995. Then, after 1995, the blue section starts to shrink. And so if we're thinking of what the factors were that enabled Japan to grow so quickly after the war, to grow so quickly from 1945 through to 1990, the increase in the quantity of labor that we see in that chart was one factor. Every year we had more and more Japanese people, more and more Japanese workers available to work in the economy. Secondly, as we've seen, most of these Japanese workers had a pretty good level of education. So this enabled Japanese labor, Japanese workers to make a productive contribution to the economy. You see here, this is Japan way back in the 1950s and 60s. It looks like a country like China or Vietnam today, but that's how things were in Japan back at that time. And so we had lots of these young, energetic Japanese people working the economy, boosting the country's economic growth. But as we'll look at later on, Japan's fertility rate started declining from the early 1970s. From the early 1970s, Japanese women started to have less and less babies. And this eventually led to a decline in the working age population. This is a major factor behind Japan's economic stagnation, the lost decades that we'll be studying in a few classes' time. So this brings us to an end of our examine of the role of labor, workers, in Japan's dramatic rise after the war. In short, there were two main factors. Japan's good education system that enabled Japanese workers to be very productive, even if we criticize some aspects. Secondly, Japan's increasing working age population, which meant that there were more and more workers available to work in the economy and to contribute to the economy. This increasing working age population is called by economists a demographic dividend. Now, in our next lecture, we will look at the role of investment, both government investment in infrastructure and private investment in Japan's rise after the war. So once again, thank you very much. Domo arigato. Now, if you have any questions, comments, reactions to this lecture, please do not hesitate to send me an email. Otherwise, you can take up these issues in our student discussion groups in mid-January. So thank you once again. Domo arigato. Sayonara.